Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second day of discourse program for the CTM theme of contact. Today, all through the day, we're going to be looking at the various ways that music and oral cultures are imprinted by various changing modes and contexts in society and social life. And we're beginning the day today with a talk with the artist Nakul Krishnamurthy, who some of us had the chance to hear yesterday in Berghain, an absolutely sublime performance. Thanks, Nakul. In his music, Nakul explores the intersection between Western classical and Indian classical musics, as well as electronic and experimental traditions. And in his release on Cafe Auto called Tesserae, he manages to bring in these different contexts and genres together into dialogue so that they challenge each other, dissolve boundaries, reshape into something new. Today he's going to be in conversation with Daniel Spicer, who is also a musician himself and a writer and longtime contributor to The Wire magazine. And this talk is presented by our partner, The Wire magazine. After the discussion, there will be a Q&A where we invite also our online audience to post questions into the YouTube chat. And yeah, without further ado, looking forward to the talk. Thank you both.
Thank you. Hi, Nakul. Nice to see you again.
Hi, it's really nice to be talking to you again.
Great, yeah. Loved the performance last night. It was great. And we were saying just now how it was very intense in the Berghain, and everyone was crowded around you and really looking at what you were doing, which is probably quite an unusual feeling.
It is, and it was a really nice audience. So I really enjoyed performing there. The space is brilliant, the sound's brilliant, and it was really kind of. I was really happy to see the audience being so involved in the process, in the listening process, which I think plays a really important part in understanding the kind of music, different kinds of so-called experimental music. So yeah, it was a really nice experience to have that kind of a response from the audience.
Sure. So we could talk a little bit maybe about the performance itself, the piece Tesserae, which is, as the name suggests, is a sort of mosaic of different influences. So obviously the Carnatic influence element of that is central. I was wondering, is it based on a specific rag?
Not exactly. So Carnatic is the South Indian classical music form. And for me, I think more than those traditional models of understanding Indian classical music like rag or the tal, which basically is the rhythm. For me, it was more about movements that kind of occur within Indian classical music, and that's something that has really fascinated me quite a lot, especially when I think about it in terms of this intersection between Indian classical and other forms of music that I work with. So I think in Tesserae, the release, and what I played live yesterday, one of the main things that I try to explore is how can we go beyond a rational theoretical model of understanding a note as something that's fixed in frequency, or the hierarchy between a fixed note in a frequency spectrum, like you have A is 440 and you have all these other C's 260 and you have all these specific frequency values, but and everything between these these values between notes kind of get sidelined in a way because they tend to be less important, so-called, than those values themselves. So for me, it was an attempt. This release was an attempt at reimagining the idea of a note as something that is fluid, something that is in motion, something that cannot be tied down by theoretical values of frequency or anything else, for that matter.
So the journey between the notes is as important as the notes themselves.
It's something that I have always said, but for me now, over the past few years, I think the movement between the notes have become more important than the notes themselves.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Okay. And how much?
But sorry, I should say that again. there is a difficulty in expressing this, because when I just said the movement between the notes are more important than the notes themselves, I'm still qualifying notes as the reference point.
Sure.
So there is no specific word that I can go to here, but I would like to reimagine the word note itself as something that is fluid.
Okay.
So a note is a combination of that movement and those and that frequency value may appear anywhere in that cloud, let's say.
Okay.
So the note as a moving entity is more important than a note as a fixed entity in frequency spectrum.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a very specific answer. How much of the performance last night is improvised? How much of it is chance an element in what you're doing?
I think that's something that I have struggled with, this idea of improvisation and trying to understand what those mean. One of the biggest, I think this goes back to a certain expectation of what the so-called experimental music or Indian classical music is supposed to be. And every time I say experimental music, it's quote-unquote experimental music, because I am personally not very happy with the term itself.
Does the term experimental music mean you don't know what you're doing?
I think the word experimental has two problems. One is its foundation in a rational scientific mode of thought, which, when mapped onto music, for me, kind of marginalizes any other mode of thought that can happen. And secondly, it has got its history. Experimental music as a form of music has a specific history which is rooted in the West. And it has an accompanying discourse, which again is drawn from a specific tradition of making music in the West. So by calling my music, and there's nothing wrong with that in terms of like someone wants to make music and call it experimental is absolutely fine. But I find it difficult to use the term because of these two factors. It's the way I think about my music and the way I present my music. I would be really happy if people do not call it experimental, because I do not want my music to be seen or understood through those prisms that have developed over the past few decades in the West. And there are specific conditions that consciously or unconsciously people have adopted over time to kind of qualify music as such. And those take the attention away from certain aspects of music that I am trying to explore. Maybe I can, if I can probably give an example that would make it clearer. I think over the past, as an artist, when I have been working in this with this kind of a music for not a really long time, in fact, probably like 5 years. And one thing that I have always found is that this is a really good thing. There is this kind of a challenge to the hegemony of Western classical music and the kind of a musicological paradigm that it has set. So the so-called experimental music has in a way fought against that, struggled against that, have always tried to challenge that, which I find extremely interesting. But in that process, what gets lost is specific aspects that can be challenged. So in my so one of the ways I have seen experimental has challenged Western classical is to question the traditional musicological model in a way. Let's say like notes or tempo or the rhythmic structure, the bar length. So you have all these traditional values that we have always spoken about that is used in like Western classical analysis. But the experimental music scene has always questioned that. But for me, those values, the so-called traditional musical values, are important but it comes from a slightly different tradition. So when I think about notes, I think from an Indian classical tradition. So it is not an erasure of the traditional musicological model, but it's a challenge to the traditional musicological model coming from outside of the West. So it is that's the main problem that I have with experimental music and this category here.
There's a real tension, isn't there, between Western classical and Carnatic music, because you talk about experimental things happening in Western classical music. That's a series of revolutions, people challenging and making it afresh. Whereas Carnatic music, it evolves. It doesn't change suddenly. It's evolved over time. Partly because it's not written down, I guess. So it changes in a more fluid way.
Yes, and that's not always a great thing. If you look at the Western classical, the radical challenges that have come, that's wonderful. But within Indian classical music, there is this very strict caste kind of a organization that Carnatic music basically functions by. And it is partly, I would say it is because of this strict gatekeeping by a certain category of people that Carnatic music has not responded to such challenges or even insulated itself from those challenges. So while from a perspective, it is really wonderful to say that it is something that slowly evolves. On the other hand, it is also problematic because it has marginalized a lot of other oppositional thinking, maybe like even alternative modes of thinking.
Yeah, so it's kind of kept in a cabinet, and you're not allowed to take it out and look at it.
Exactly. The only place where you can use it as a comparison is probably as a challenge to Western classical. So
right, sure.
It kind of creates its own hierarchy in the subaltern.
Well, let's talk about this a bit more. The way in which your work is sort of challenging Indian classical's kind of hegemony in Indian society. So your music is really sort of trying to get around that there are gatekeepers that let you have the music. I guess if people listen to your music in India, they experience it very differently than they experience it in the West.
Absolutely, that's a really interesting thing that I've observed. The people, the audience here, whenever I play here in the UK or in Europe, they can hear a very, very strong influence of South Indian classical music, and they might they can just call it, like they say that's Indian classical music being presented in a different format. But when I play to people back there in India, they say this is not Indian classical music at all.
Right.
So this is something else altogether. We don't think of it as Indian classical music. So it is kind of, in a way, it's interesting because you are being, or the music is being othered by both categories right now. The West says that, oh, it's Indian, and the people in India say, it's not Indian.
Right.
So where do you sit? But it's a very interesting place to be as an artist because it kind of makes you happy that you're challenging both sides at the same time. So I think for me, it is the fact that the Indian audience say that it is not Indian classical is a very good position because it kind of visibilizes an alternative imagination of Indian classical music that has not happened, probably. Maybe it has happened in a lot of other ways, and I think I would draw comparisons of my music to actually some of the experiments that happens in Indian film music or Indian popular music. So that space, that alternative space that kind of lays outside of Indian classical, kind of showing that there are alternative ways of thinking about it, and within that space, rethinking those hierarchies within the Indian society in terms of specifically the musical hierarchy and the caste system that enables it, kind of is what I try to do, and that's my mode of challenging that hegemonic structure, I think.
So is your music a shocking thing to an Indian audience?
Shocking is a strong word.
Provocative?
I don't know.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
At least I don't want it to be provocative or anything. It's fine if it is, but what I want is an acceptance that there are alternative modes of imagining Indian classical music that can be less hierarchical, maybe can even challenge those hierarchies within.
Because presumably then a lot of, you talk about the caste system and how that, helps to quantify the music. By trying to circumvent that, you're trying to widen access to it. And maybe there are people who feel marginalized who don't feel that they're able to engage with Indian classical music.
Widen, again, these are strong words. I think it is, I don't. These kind of approaches, I think, kind of try to position a person or an approach as the savior or as the person who's going to reimagine the whole scene. I think it is just a way of showing another mode of thinking, and it is not. It has. That's all it is. It's something that can imagine an alternative space, and people can engage with it. They may not, and that's fine. But at least a space has to exist. That's it. The space doesn't have to take over. It doesn't have to do anything. It has to be a safe space that holds its respect, and it doesn't really have to kind of marginalize the other. It's not inverting the paradigm. It's about opening it up.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. So
I think so.
Yeah. Okay. We were talking a little bit earlier about how that the way that the Indian classical music is quite rigidly presented in India is actually a result of colonialism as well. So prior to, say, the 19th century, the music was more freely available to people, and then sort of the British imposed sort of Western classical music modes of engaging with it onto that music, and therefore made it this rigid thing, right?
Yes, that is correct. So prior to probably the early part of the 1900s, there were Carnatic, the South Indian classical music, which is Carnatic music, was not understood as this one specific way of singing. There were different ways of imagining South Indian classical music. But what happened in the early half of the 1900s was the Orientalist thought and the writing by British musicologists in India kind of tried to understand it from a Western frame, from a Western perspective. And there were this specific community of people who at that point wanted to reimagine and reinterpret Indian classical to be another classical form. So the word classical being used to understand Indian classical itself is a result of that. Right. So because South Indian classical music has not had a classical period, so it is kind of ironic that the word classical is there. But it kind of tried to model itself both in the image of the Western classical as well as a challenge to Western classical. So it was like, this is also classical. So that's borrowing the model of classical from the West, but it is different from your classical. And this is why it's different. But in that process of making it classical, you had to have, like the West, a proper theoretical paradigm. You had to have a trinity of composers. You had to have compositions, first of all. So all these kind of shaped Indian classical music to be something that was both in opposition to and in the image of the West. So, and in that process, it became more rigid. You had theoretical models defined, showing how ragas should function, how talas should function, how a performance should function, how the performer should sit on stage, how they should present themselves on stage, but in a way that is not an exact copy, but rather a response, let's say. So it is, there's a huge impact of colonialism on Indian classical music, and this endeavor to kind of imagine Carnatic music as it is today was taken up at that point by the newly educated in the colonial modernity, the newly educated upper caste Brahmins. Yeah. So that's how the Brahminical hegemony came about in Indian classical music. So, and
that's still very strong.
That is still very strong.
Right.
Yeah. So it is those. I think for me it is taking those ideas that were kind of born out of that period's understanding of positioning themselves both in the image and in opposition to the West. It's taking those aspects, those rigid structures that came about during that period, and it still continues to it has evolved, obviously, but it still continues to this day in a slightly different format. It is about taking those aspects and questioning them, rethinking them to imagine a space where such strict rules are not exclusive anymore, and such strict rules can be broken down. They are not sacred, and yeah, and you have kind of like experiment with it.
Yeah. So you grew up in Kerala in the south of India.
That's correct. Yep.
And as a child, you were sort of expected to learn Carnatic. It was sort of just a given, something that you would do.
Not expected, but as from a born into a Brahmin family, it was something that was, in a way, sort of natural to do. My family, my mother has learned Indian classical music, and her family, her sister, and it's like, it kind of runs in the family that you kind of go take Carnatic lessons. So
Okay.
I just did that. I didn't really like going there. When they used to send me alone to my classes, I would just like walk and just not go to the class, just hang around and looking at all these small streams. It was a very small village, so playing in the stream and not going to the classes, ending up there like 45 minutes late for a 1 hour class. And then my grandmom started accompanying me, making sure that I got there. So it was kind of that.
You told me before that your parents wanted you to study music to stop you from playing too much cricket.
Oh, that's true, yeah. Yeah, I was always running out, and trying to play cricket, and this was, for them, a way of getting me to do something else.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you grew up listening to that music, but also film music was an important
I
sound.
think, yeah, apart from Indian classical music, film music was the only other music that I grew up on. So that was the only thing that was available at that time. So my parents would buy me like an audio cassette of film music once every 5 months, 6 months, and I would keep listening to that over and over again. I wouldn't listen to Indian classical at all, and just this film music over and over, and until like 6 months later, there's something else that has come out, and I just asked them to buy me one, and that's I kind of listened to that. So I was brought up on a very strict film music diet, and there was, and interestingly, there was nothing else. So until I was 16, I had not heard of rock music. I did not know what rock music was. And for me, there was just one category of music called Western music, which consisted of 4 Michael Jackson songs, 1 Boney M album, and that's it, I guess. Oh, 1 Aerosmith song.
That's a pretty good survey. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's like Western. That was Western music for me. And then I ended up in a city in Chennai and suddenly realized that there are other kinds of music. Hated them initially.
Right.
But then the first proper rock band for me that I was a fan of, I'm probably ashamed to admit it, but it was Nickelback. And Nickelback was like, wow, that's music. And then, yeah, then that changed.
Amazing.
Fortunately.
Yeah. And then you tried your hand at composing some film music as well, right? That was something you gave a shot at for a while.
Yes. So I was trying to, for me, making music, I knew that I wanted to make music, but then for me, the only way you could make music in India, at least for me, was like being a film musician. So I kind of sang for movies, and then I composed for a movie, and it didn't really, I didn't really enjoy it as much. It was, I would say, yeah, there was a certain level of enjoyment, but it was not satisfying. And that's when I was also doing an undergrad course in Chennai at KM Music Conservatory, which is affiliated to Middlesex University in London. And I was doing an undergrad course in Western classical composition because I just wanted to see what else was there and try to get me out of this Indian classical mindset, which by then I had learned for around 14 years.
Right.
About 10 years against my wishes, but the rest of the 4 years actually I liked it.
So then you started studying Western classical music,
Yeah.
which again is quite a large
Yes.
amount of music.
Yep.
Difference between Beethoven and
Yeah. I started
Stockhausen.
with Renaissance, then did a whole lot of analysis on Bach, then Mozart, and obviously Beethoven was a star, and Wagner. I've done so many pastiche works of Wagner, and I think I still like Wagner's music a lot. And then Schoenberg. So yeah, the whole Western classical canon, the whole thing in undergrad. At the same time, composing using those techniques.
Right. Okay.
And at the same time, I took a break from South Indian classical and did 3 years of North Indian classical and 2 years of operatic singing. So yeah, quite a mix.
Yeah. So did your Carnatic singing background help with the operatic singing, or were they just completely different?
I think that is a very interesting question. It helped, but the problem was the way Western classical was taught in was kind of, let's say, indirectly positioned itself as better than Indian classical music.
Right.
So by the end of the course, I came out thinking that Western classical music is superior to Indian classical music. And operatic singing, because it has got all these techniques that you need to learn, was superior to Indian classical singing.
Right.
Extremely problematic now I look back, but that's how it, even though Indian classical music helped me understand, so I still can't read Western notation. So the first thing is that I look at the tonic and I understand where the tonic is, and the sight singing that we had to do was all in my head based on South Indian classical notations.
Right.
So I would just transpose it in my head and sing. But I wouldn't accept it. I wouldn't admit that, because that's an inferior way of singing.
Right. That's strange, isn't it? It's ridiculous.
It is.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's Western classical music being taught. This whole argument, a lot of people say that Western classical being able to reach all these people in different parts of the world, it's becoming more and more diverse. But the problem with that argument is that it is not becoming diverse in a very good way. It is more colonial in its diversity. It is still doing the same thing, going back and teaching Wagner, sees this superior music. Now listen to this. This is what you have to do. And then you have some people from India performing in orchestras. Oh yeah, we are diverse. No, you just colonize them.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's shocking, isn't it, that the colonial aspect of this is still so strong.
Absolutely. It is so strong. And I think it is something that it's not just restricted to Western classical music, I would say. But to a much less extent, Western classical is probably like, to a very bad extent, it's still there. But in other forms of music, I think it kind of still is subtle, but still present. And I think for me, that's a major concern. I think, again, this talk, contact, right? So this whole idea of contact itself is a brilliant initiative, but I think we need to we need to be critical about it. We cannot uncritically celebrate contact, because Western classical being taught in India is contact, right? Mm-hmm. But it is contact. So for me, it was contact. They taught me Western classical. I used Indian classical to understand it. It was contact, but it was not. It was problematic. So contact is something that we need to be very careful about, and we need to think about it. And this is not just like, that is just Western classical. Now, if we think about experimental music, this again in quotes, we have a similar problem, because we tend to celebrate contact in terms of different traditions, kind of people kind of coming from different traditions, exploring this idea of experimental in different ways. But as a community, does the so-called experimental music community, or the people who enjoy such music, are they engaging with this music at these intersections, or are they engaging it from their privileged position of being within the experimental music community? I know that's a difficult thing to kind of sometimes think about, but what I am trying to say is that this idea of contact, this productive intersection of contact, let's say, where we challenge such structures, those as artists, when we do, as listeners, if we still engage with it from a colonial or an Orientalist perspective, that becomes a problem. Yeah. Now, let me, I probably give you an example so that it kind of, with my music, I think that makes more sense. One of the most common responses I get to my performance, my music, is that it was really relaxing, meditative, kind of like reflection and kind of being lost.
In a trance.
In a trance,
right,
yes.
Right.
And all this is a very common response. I actually, I am not really comfortable with that. And I think it has got a lot to do with this whole, the cliched understanding. It is not, I'm not saying it is like, very it's a very, it works in the background, we have already been reinforced by this whole thinking that India is a place of meditation, India is a place of inner peace, that's where you reflect, you have this inner reflection and you kind of like get lost in yourself.
Yeah.
And it kind of is reinforced in a lot of different ways, even without us understanding, in movies or wherever, in all public culture, it's there in a lot of different ways. So what happens is that slowly carries on and kind of gets molded into different forms and being imposed in so the so-called experimental music understanding too. So when someone engages with my music as a spiritual experience, it is problematic because that's not what I'm doing. Unfortunately, this comes not because, I would say it doesn't come because of the music that I play, it comes with the associations that people have held for long about Indian classical music.
Sure.
So when you wouldn't listen to Moonlight Sonata and say that was meditative, that took me to a trance. You would probably, but not as much. You would actually, most people would actually do a analysis of the harmonic analysis of it.
Right.
But why would something as slow as the Moonlight Sonata, let's say, why would that take on a totally different way of interpretation, while the music that I play kind of removes all these elements and gets us into that space of spirituality? I think this is problematic. I think another reason for this, apart from the Orientalist thought, I think is that there is, and this is, I found it really interesting. When we have experimental, if we take the experimental, and again in quotes always, music scene and underground music scene, there is a kind of a fight against the hegemony of Western classical music, right? And the way it understands music. Now this whole community rethinks music and kind of imagines it in new ways. And suddenly you see a person like me, for instance, coming from India and doing really different things. Like, again, challenging the same Western classical music. There is an assumption that, which is partly true, assumption that I belong to the same community, which is good. I feel welcome. I am immediately embraced as a part of this society, which is really cool. But at the same time, we have to understand that it is not a two-tier system. It's not like Western classical and everyone else. There is graded inequalities, right? So you have different, within experimental music, there is still a subaltern, people coming from the outside who try to engage with the same question in different ways. And in a lot of places, a lot of, these ways and people think about it, the problem emerges when people think that it's the same, and it's the music that he is presenting, and let's call it experimental music, and that's it. We use the same parameters as experimental music to understand, to analyze, to appreciate the music. And when it comes to like the music that I present, obviously when we challenge the Western classical hegemony, we kind of challenge their understanding of the musicological tools. And yeah, so the experimental music kind of does away with that and has a new set of tools and implement those same set of tools to understand my music. And combined with Orientalist thought, it emerges as something where you do not understand, you do not think about the musicological side of it, you think about the spiritual side of it, the experience of it, rather being immersed in it. But if you look at my music specifically, there is a lot of specific attempt at reimagining, like I said, the idea of a note. What happens when notes are always moving, but they intersect with each other? What happens at those intersections? What are the sounds that we hear that is new? Instead of like having a harmony which is like C, E, and G, what if C is moving? What if E is moving? What if G is moving? Are we still hearing the same thing? And what if they do not intersect at the same time? Do we have a harmonic perception? Do we have a melodic perception? Or are we in between both of these? So there are different ways of thinking of, and for me, these are important. But again, I'm not using the tools of Western classical. I'm challenging them, but still using similar musicological tools. So and for that reason, if you look at the experience, a performance of my piece yesterday would seem to be exactly the same as another performance that I do. But someone who used these tools would actually see the level of improvisation that you asked, because these intersections are different every time. But if you do not pay attention to these intersections, you only think about the feeling of it, it's the same. So the changes are subtle, and you need to be able to look at where those changes are. You need to be kind of like, responsive to something beyond the discourse of experimental music and something that is coming from outside of it. And that would be the true generative potential of contact. If we can not just question those hierarchies and decolonize music generally, but decolonize our own listening too.
Sure.
The way we listen to the music has to be responsive to that intersection and not be comfortably from within the way we generally engage with the so-called experimental music.
So we've talked about how your work sits at an intersection.
Yeah.
Essentially, you're asking your audience to inhabit that intersection in an active way,
Yeah.
and be involved in listening in a way which is following what you're doing, rather than getting lost in a drone and all that.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. So it is kind of inviting the audience, and it's very difficult to do that through music unless you kind of have a talk accompanying it, just saying explicitly some of these things. And I think for me, the most important thing about such intersections and what falls through in those cracks of those intersections, that's what I try to draw out. I would really like my audience, when I play music, the audience also to be kind of existing in those cracks, kind of drawing from those cracks to rethink their own position themselves, and not just uncritically celebrate experimental music as this new thing that challenges everything. That itself creates this hierarchy. Then experimental music becomes kind of higher than the other forms of music that kind of get marginalized again. Right. So I think experimental music as a community should also be a bit more introspective in acknowledging that there are diverse tools, diverse ways in which we engage with it, and be always kind of, ready to kind of shift those places and look at those, the periphery in a way.
Just to return to this idea of the sort of Orientalism as well, which is another way of saying racism, really, isn't it?
It is, but it is really subtle. So
exactly,
I guess
exactly.
A very good example would be the feature that you had interviewed me for The Wire. And I really had a lot of fun talking to you, and that was a really nice article too. But when I saw the final version of it, I don't know if you have seen that, but on the page you have like written drone on top and a picture of me standing like this. And I'm like, no, that's not what I've spoken about. Right. First of all, the idea of drone takes away the attention from everything else that I've been trying to do. It kind of puts it in this box, this genre within like experimental music again. Kind of like, this is how we understand it. We don't care what you're doing there as long as it sounds like this to us. So if you draw comparisons between my music and the New York school of like minimalism, right, you would find similarities because they are both drawing from Indian classical music, but they're doing radically different things.
Sure.
And that's why I would say my music is more similar to Indian film music, even Bollywood, than New York school of minimalism. Right. And then the other thing, the photo of me, there were like 8 or 9 photos, and the photographer had listened to my music, and they taken a few pictures. And the picture that got selected, there's just one where I was standing next to a tree in a state of meditation, kind of like Buddha, that whole spirituality being channeled, and we're like, no, the whole article is about how that's not the case.
Right.
So it is kind of subtle, and I don't know where it comes from. We don't think about it consciously. Why am I choosing this picture? Why am I putting that word drone there?
Sure.
Those need to be asked. Yeah. Those need to be revisited. All the time we need to be engaged with that question.
So you need to constantly challenge people's perceptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah.
There's no way out.
Good luck with that.
Oh, this is going to be a fun ride.
So we should talk about how you got involved with experimental music in the first place, because we've talked about how you had this classical upbringing, Indian classical upbringing, and then you had Western classical education. And then I think it was sort of almost a chance encounter, wasn't it, with Mark Fell and Ryan Trainer?
Yeah, we met randomly. Mark Fell is an amazing musician, and Ryan Trainer, they were in India and in Chennai, and I was giving a talk there at a music festival, and they happened to be in the bar upstairs. And I was, and the producer of Counterflows Festival, Alastair, he happened to see this talk, and he was there, and he saw me and said hi, and just introduced me to Mark and Ryan. And then we spoke about music, and suddenly they were like, do you want to work with us for a project for Counterflows? Like, yeah, sure. Because I didn't know what they did back then. I was still coming from I was still in that phase right after my undergrad in Western classical, still thinking Western classical is superior.
Right.
And then I heard Mark's music, and I was like, what's going on here? This is different. And fortunately, I had the patience and I had the courage to kind of open up my mind and think about this music from a different perspective, and that was really fortunate for me. And I did that, and I worked with them. I came to the Counterflows Festival, I remember, in 2017, and I didn't understand anything that was going on. It was totally different. It was kind of like discovering rock music back when I was 17.
Right.
This is something else. But then the more and more I listened to it, the more I realized that this is something that really interests me. And this has got, and if I think about this from my position uh, as an Indian classical musician who has learned Western classical and has experimented with experimental Western classical composition in the course, maybe there is something that I can bring to this. And maybe that'll help me figure out where I stand as a musician, because I've had these conflicting influences: film music, South Indian classical music, North Indian classical music, operatic singing, and then Western classical compositional practice. And all these coming together, where do I stand? It just seems like all these different things, and who am I? I don't know. But then this kind of music kind of gave me a space to be comfortable with all of these at once and find that point where I could just exist as I wouldn't say an amalgamation or a melting pot. That I think those words kind of take the attention away from the actual question, but from the cracks of all of these, and I could find that space, and I'm really happy that I met Mark and Ryan that day.
Yeah, but it's totally opened things up to you to a completely different
Absolutely.
audience.
And that started, and right now, sitting here talking to you, it's because of that chance encounter. But I would also say it has got a lot to do with my upbringing, how my parents encouraged me to take up music, and the whole classical music training. I have started going back to Indian classical music now. I'm continuing my classes again. So
I was going to ask you, do you still sing?
yes, but one of the reasons why I do not sing, again, this is another question that a lot of people have asked me. Why don't you sing on stage if you are using a recorded voice? I think one of the reasons why I want to not sing on stage is that Indian classical music has traditionally been like a singer's form of music, right? The singer sings, there's a solo voice, or if two people, they kind of exchange, is a duet, but it's almost always a single singer performing a single line. But for me, it is about taking a step back and thinking about the possibilities if I'm not singing live on stage. Right? This other ways of thinking about it, and this kind of takes us to another problem. What am I doing if I'm just opening my computer in front of an audience and clicking play on different things that I'm singing?
Right.
But that is where, for me, the idea of improvisation comes in slightly differently. Instead of that, what I do is I think of a note as a movement, as I said, and the different ways of thinking about a note as a movement. Right. So I record each of my thoughts of a note into clips, and then what I do live on stage is those intersections. So, but again, the problem that comes from the experimental music understanding and how they imagine the field to be is that a person just sitting on their laptop triggering phrases, probably not that interesting. He's just as a controller on stage. And again, that is those biases creeping in slowly. Oh, I understand experimental music to be something that does, maybe you should sing on stage, maybe you should do that on stage. But it is, I think one thing that my friend Tom Knapp from Leeds is a very good friend. He told me once was that I was really confused about how to bring about an idea, and he said, "Don't worry about the tools that you're using. As long as your music is interesting, it's fine.
Right.
Do whatever." And that was the day I decided that maybe I'm not going to sit down and learn Max now. I'll use Ableton. That's fine.
Okay.
As long as the music that I'm making out of it, and I'm using Ableton in a way that is different from the regular modes of using it.
Yeah.
And that's what I still use. I still use just Ableton and recorded voice of mine, and I play them. But I think I like to believe that I use it in a way that is different and to a productive end.
But the vocal samples that we heard last night, that's your voice.
That's my voice,
Right.
yes. And there are probably around 150 to 200 vocal samples in there, triggered at different points of time.
Wow. Okay.
So, I guess it is the way you trigger them that kind of makes it a unifying experience, but not overbearing at the same time. You cannot trigger all 200 at the same time and just go back.
Right.
So you need to be kind of like really judicious about when to do that. And I think that is the improvisatory, performative aspect of my music.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. I think we're going to see if we've got any questions coming in, either from the room or from online.
Online is quiet at the moment.
Okay.
Maybe someone in the room has a question.
Yes.
Hey, thank you. Thanks very much. You mentioned associations earlier when talking both about your work and the way that your work is perceived. And I've been thinking about this question a lot because even in the Orientalism discourse, ultimately it's about associations. This ideas about what India is and what India represents are all associations. And I guess I would like to know, for you, what are your associations with your music? When you're creating it, when you're listening to it, what do you see? What do you associate it with?
That's an excellent question. Thanks, Kai. I think this was until 3 years back, when I played this kind of music, I would get a response that it was really kind of like meditative and spiritual. And I thought, okay, as long as they like it, maybe I relate to it slightly differently, but for me, meditative works, it's fine. Maybe, yeah, probably it is meditative because India, there's a reason why India is known as meditative. That was my thinking back then. I did not know about Orientalism at that time. And then what helped me was getting those tools, critical thinking tools. So I guess those have changed the way I think about my music. Until then, my thinking, my understanding of Indian classical music, all those associations were drawn from the Orientalist perspective and were exactly or almost very similar to how the West would view India. Because if the West views India this way, that's probably the right way to view India. That's probably the right way to think about it. So I was like, yeah, cool. That's how India is. That's how I am. That's how my music is. But then over the past 3 years, I've been doing my research at the University of Edinburgh and doing my PhD. And then I started getting all these critical modes of thinking about this question. And then I realized my biases are really formed by this Orientalist thought. So today, I think the way I see my music is the associations that I have with my music. And this is more about how there is, it kind of emerges from a crack between Indian classical music, which for me is something that I engage with very actively. I hear each of those expressions that Indian classical, the singers sing, and think about how creative they are, innovative they are, and how they bring out the beauty of a raga, rather than stepping back and just being in a trance. I'm actively thinking about each thing that they're singing and how they beautifully make it work. And for me, at the same time, kind of stepping out of that zone to rethink how specific structures within it can be questioned, because there are oppressive structures within it. So that's the way those are my associations at the moment, which may change as I gain more critical tools, but that's where I stand today.
Any more questions?
I have a question.
There's one there.
I was curious about your thoughts on accessibility in music. So like a lot of music that maybe a Western audience is not familiar with, maybe you get comments like, I don't understand it, I don't get it. And so I guess, I work in the quote unquote, experimental music sort of thing. And yeah, it's sort of the criticism that you get. And so I was wondering your thoughts on like working with people who sort of demand accessibility in the music in terms of like both duration, how long the set is, but also the material and like the content.
Could you please clarify a bit more what you mean by accessibility? Is it people wanting to know more about the music, or people wanting the music to suit a particular interest of theirs?
I guess this is coming from more of like a Western experimental background, and the criticism of that a lot is it's not immediately understandable.
I think that's an interesting question. Why would they think Beethoven is immediately understandable, as opposed to experimental music? Beethoven's not immediately understandable to me.
I don't understand opera.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's a very difficult question. Why would, Beethoven's Ninth, which probably runs for 1.5 hours, be easily accessible, but an experimental music performance of 45 minutes? Now, I think, again, it has got a lot to do with the way we engage with it. And duration is one thing, harmonic complexity is another thing. But we kind of have somehow understood harmonic complexity as something that is like, yeah, it is not accessible, but that is supposed to be something that is amazing. So let us just listen to it. On the way to this gig today, this talk today, I was in a cab, and they were the driver had put on Strauss's music, and I was like, he's not complaining about accessibility. I'm not blaming him, but I'm thinking about the whole mindset that would raise this question. It has got something to do with the acceptance of the fact that the inaccessibility of a certain kind is okay, but so-called this is inaccessible because there is not enough appreciation for it, maybe not enough effort put into it. I guess there is that hierarchy at play again. That's what I think. I don't know how I would respond to such a comment. I would probably just smile. But I think there is a much deeper problem at work here, which I think can only be challenged through making more work and talking more about it and creating more awareness and breaking down those hierarchical structures so that people who engage with Beethoven for 1.5 hours can, without understanding a single harmonic resolution of it, can also engage with experimental music in that sense. Probably.
We do have some questions from the online audience.
Okay.
There's time. So first question, is it the artist's job to decolonize their work for the audience?
Oh, that's a brilliant question. It is a very, that's something that I have thought about a lot. And in fact, Khayyam and we have had a discussion about it. Job is a powerful word, again. There are a lot of powerful words being thrown around today. So I think the onus of decolonizing shouldn't fall on the marginalized at all. But at the same time, as a person who is able to sit here today and talk, I think it gives me, I also really like it. I like talking about these questions, thinking about this issue, sometimes thinking out loud and getting these responses. I wouldn't say it's the job of the musician or an artist, but I think for me, it is something that needs to be done. Unfortunately, no one is doing. Sometimes to call out biases, to call out these kind of like Orientalist thought or whatever it is, this colonial tendencies again today, I think it needs a voice from the outside sometimes to actually create awareness, maybe shed light on this issue. A lot of people wouldn't have been aware of the issues with telling me my music is spiritual. But if someone points them to that direction, maybe just gives a comment or talks for like half an hour, it can create that awareness, which can have an impact later on, maybe kind of like spread that awareness. And I think someone has to raise a question, unfortunately, and the onus shouldn't fall on the people who are marginalized or the subaltern. But if that's to be done, you have to do it.
So a second question from online. Does classical dance follow the same path as music in terms of it being subject to strict Western rules that you discussed?
Classical dance. Indian classical dance?
Not specified.
Should be Indian classical dance. They are. Oh, that's a whole another story. We can talk about that for an hour, but I'm not an expert in that field, and there was an even more stronger purification that happened in South Indian classical dance because it was considered to be the art form of so-called Devadasis, who were women dedicated to the temples, who also supposedly, and they were invited to big courts to dance, and also they were prostitutes in a very conservative way of thinking about it. That's how they were imagined, and suddenly Indian classical dance had to be rescued from such debauchery, and they were like, okay, we need to reimagine the dance. We need to stop those sensual movements. We need to stop drawing attention to the body. The woman who's dancing shouldn't touch themselves. If they are touching this, that movement becomes this. And I'm not an expert, but my wife's a South Indian classical dancer, and she has told me quite a lot about this. So And I also worked with a dancer recently, and oh, that is a totally different domain of operation. That's on another level altogether. Unfortunately.
Can I just apologise on behalf of Britain?
Thank you. But I guess this fact that we are having this conversation and you're being receptive, I think that's great. That's what is needed.
Sure.
There is obviously a history, but we also have to think about what we have to do, what we're doing.
Sure.
We shouldn't just be like sitting back with guilt, and we should need to be actively breaking down these these structures. And as an ally, that is, I'm really thankful that you're here as an ally, and all of you. So that's good.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, and thank you all for coming.
Thanks a lot for having me, and thank you. Thanks.
So good to see you. Yeah.